Clendenin, an emergency management expert with Texas A&M School of Public Health. Angela, cities, provinces, states, countries, you name it, can plan for disaster. But then the day comes when you have something like this far and beyond anyone's imagining. Can you really plan for something like this?
You really can't plan for things of this big of a magnitude, but the opposing view is what would it look like if they had not planned for anything?
Hmm.
So the fact that there are plans in place, that there is a command and control system, that there are responders from all around the world coming in, doing their best to find as many survivors as they can, it would be sure chaos without any kind of planning.
Yeah.
So
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Angela. Sorry.
that's okay. I was just going to say, so, it's really important that we recognize planning is a key part of response. And it may look terrible, but it could have been so, so much worse.
So how would you describe what are, in your view, the most essential elements to a successful response?
So, the number one thing that we find after every disaster that always seems to be a challenge, something that is identified as needing to be improved, is communication. And that's communication between the public, the government, the response groups, and especially amplified when you have response groups from all around the world all coming in. They've been trained fairly similarly. They have very similar command and control structures, but you want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Everybody wants to help. This is one of the things I've always said about disasters. It brings out sometimes the very best in people. You want to help your neighbor, you
Hmm.
want to help your community, but you get these volunteers coming in that don't know how to integrate into a response, and sometimes they can even be problematic. So the communication aspect is probably the most important thing to a successful response.
That's a very good point. I've covered a lot of disasters. I've been on the scenes of, you name it, the type of disaster, and I've never seen it in the early hours and days not be very chaotic and people feel like the world is tumbling down.
Absolutely. Many people are looking at they've lost family, they've lost friends, they've lost neighbors, they've lost homes, they've lost livelihoods. Disasters are completely disruptive to our way of life. And so for the people who have been impacted, it can seem very chaotic and very psychologically impactful as well. For responders, there is an order, there is a process, there is a structure in place. So it's a little less chaotic for them than it is for the public, but sometimes the public doesn't always see those organizational elements that are operating around them.
Yeah, I think the public almost never sees that, to be honest, just from what I've seen on the ground. I wanted to ask you too, what do you think that humanity has learned from past disasters? Because we see a disaster, several of them a year now, especially climate-related disasters.
Well, I think there's no doubt that climate change is affecting weather patterns. It's affecting the very environment that we interact with and that we live within. So disasters are becoming more intense as well as more frequent, and you're seeing disasters happen in places that aren't necessarily familiar with those types of disasters. So you're getting, blizzards and snow disasters further and further south. You're getting heat related disasters further and further north. And so it's really pretty complicated when you think about the impact that it can have on these populations that really have no experience with these kinds of disasters. So planning is important,
Hmm.
communication is important, and making sure that, when we think about the impact on humanity, we have to learn that disasters impact people and all across the board. Nobody is immune from a disaster. And we have to be able to come together to support one another, to be there for one another, and to look at ways we can invest in the future to help reduce the impact of disasters.
You know what, Angela? I'm going to be really blunt here. Okay, speaking of, say, a hurricane that happens in Florida. So many times I have seen immediately after a disaster like that, people expect their government to be right there immediately. And they're in line for water, fighting with each other. And they're saying, where's the supplies? Or why didn't somebody come and evacuate me immediately? And I always just think, it's nobody's fault if you didn't watch the news yourself and know that this was coming, or if you didn't stockpile in your home water and food in case of disaster. Have people lost the ability to help the process themselves?
I don't think that people necessarily have lost the ability to help the process themselves. I think in a lot of ways, people don't like to think the worst is going to happen to them. Particularly if you want to go back to your hurricane example, people in Florida, people along the Texas coast, Louisiana coast, they are used to hurricanes and they are used to this kind of love hate relationship with the ocean. The ocean is their playground, it's their workplace, it's always there. And so historically, they have this familiarity with hurricanes, which reduces their
Mm,
ability to recognize their own personal risk. And so I think that's part of the issue. We saw some of it with COVID. People that felt like they were not at risk from COVID engaged in a little more risky behaviors. So I think, the big push is for us to have a better understanding of how people perceive their own personal risk and then try to find ways to move the needle so that people, again, feel a little more motivated to be prepared and to take responsibility for their personal preparedness. So
yeah.
you can't really blame the people, but you can't really blame the government either. It's a risk perception thing, a familiarity thing, as well as I don't know that this will ever happen to me in my lifetime thing.
Yeah. Good points, Angela. Really interesting conversation. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.